We found that many individuals are able to accurately describe what's going on in distant locations, blocked from any kind of ordinary perception.
Welcome to Vanadium. The more I learn about this mad world, the more mysterious it seems to me. And what if I were to tell you that it was possible for me to see, across time, across space, to see history, to see the future, to go to Mars, to see the rings of Jupiter? You would say, he's crazy. That's crazy. And it is crazy. The thing is that it's proven to work, and that people can be trained to perform remote viewing reliably. And this has been shown, and with a lot of the different kind of cases that I've talked about on this show, statistically, and that scientists don't have a way of explaining what's happening, but they know what's happening. And sometimes it's easier to pretend something doesn't exist rather than admit there's something there that is huge, potentially frightening. And scientists are just people, and no one likes to admit they don't know something, especially somebody whose job it is to know stuff. So the case of remote viewing is what got me started in the direction of going a little outside the scientific boundaries. And it's because of just the evidence behind it. And the other thing is, even more interesting than looking at data, is the fact that the U.S. government and U.S. military don't think it's bunk. In fact, they rely on it enough to have spent decades funding it to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars over time. And a lot of the people that have worked in this program and these different programs have come forward and talked about their experiences. And I think with just a little bit of evidence, you'll be swayed the same way I was when I looked into remote viewing.
The example that got me thinking, I came across several years ago, about an experiment in 1973 with a very convincing and dramatic result. It involved one of the most advanced scientific instruments at the time, a space probe called Pioneer 10, and a prominent government agency essentially conducting a seance. It involved the planet Jupiter, the rings of Jupiter. When it comes to planetary rings, the most obvious example is Saturn. Those are visible to even amateur astronomers. It took science some time to work out the subtle structure of rings and moons around Jupiter. And this is where it comes to the famous experiment. So Pioneer 10 was well on its way to survey Jupiter, to do basically a fast pass and take all sorts of measurements, photographs and infrared and UV measurements. So this famous experiment involved a man with a very mystical sounding name, Ingo Swan. So I'm just going to read. So what happened was this satellite, this space probe Pioneer 10, was well on its way to Jupiter to do a fast pass, get some information. And that's when this government agency, this would be the CIA, came to a couple of researchers who were researching remote viewing at the time. And they asked them to come for an interview. And they didn't tell them what it was about, but what they essentially simultaneously had them perform remote viewing sessions. So it was Ingo Swan and another guy, Sherman. And they simultaneously performed a remote viewing experiment, Jupiter. And they asked them about the space probe, Pioneer 10. And so I'm going to read a little bit of that report. So it's very sort of plain spoken in here. As a result of conversations between Mr. Harold Sherman of Mountain View, Arkansas, and Mr. Ingo Swan of New York, in an attempt to carry forward the possibility of the psychic nature of men, it was decided to hold a psychic probe of the planet Jupiter. This document I'm reading from is taken from CIA.gov, so that makes it official. So while probing by other physical means of a far distant planet seems extraordinary, it was noted that the Jupiter Bypass NASA Space Module Pioneer 10 was on its way, and hopefully will relay back data as yet not known to science. So they were trying to see if these guys could beat the space probe and get information on the structure of the outskirts of Jupiter before the space probe. And then when they got the information back from Pioneer 10, they'd be able to compare it. Here, I'm just going to read another part here. Based on this situation, it was decided to probe psychically the planet Jupiter. It's from a CIA website. This is an official report. In the evening of April 27, 1973, therefore, Mr. Sherman arranged to begin his probe at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time, and Mr. Swann, currently on the West Coast, so they were separated, at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. The psychic probes thus took place simultaneously. After 1/2 hour, Mr. Sherman was reached by telephone by Mr. Swann, and the results compared. Certain salient points of the obvious similarities between the results of both men follow. The actual responses of both men were recorded and are attached as an Annex A, Mr. Sherman's response, and Annex B, Mr. Swann's response. Neither Mr. Sherman nor Mr. Swann claim validity for their results, since to do so would be beside any scientific point. What verification might come from Pioneer 10 remains to be seen. And this is where it gets really interesting. So I'm just going to go over the similarities in the reports. So Sherman and Swann gave, not identical reports, but with a lot of specific overlap. So they both mentioned these crystals and diamond-like sparkles in the atmosphere. And both described giving off a distinctly golden yellow. And as they got deeper to the planet, they both talked about these cloud layers of different colors, yellow, red, ultraviolet, green, like a giant fireworks display. And that's how Bill Sherman described it. Mr. Swann described, inside those cloud layers, they look beautiful from the outside. From the inside, they look like rolling gas clouds, eerie yellow light, rainbows. And they both talk about the enormous, Mr. Sherman says, the enormous cloud cover. And then Mr. Swann says, then I came across the cloud cover. And they both talk about the cloud cover being very thick on Jupiter. And there was no scientific evidence available at the time to suggest that I'm aware of. So when it came to the surface, they both talk about a reddish-brown formation extending in a curved line, and the horizon looking orangish, and sort of flat for the most part. But there appeared to be, and they both mentioned this, huge volcanic peaks, these huge great cones rising miles. And so Mr. Sherman described it as rising some miles, and Ingo Swan described it as ranging 31,000 feet high. And they both mentioned this like really hot look to the place. And Ingo Swan mentioned that the Pioneer 10 would likely yield a very high infrared count, which it did. And they both talk about ice crystals that form sort of these patterns. And this is where the rings come in. So these rings are actually not exactly like the rings of Saturn that are so easy to spot, so the contrast so strong. These are extremely subtle. And one other, really, and this is maybe one of the most remarkable things about it, in this report dated, basically there was more than 6 months before Pioneer 10 was due to actually make contact with Jupiter. But both subjects said that the Pioneer 10 was going to encounter some sort of problem, and they weren't sure exactly what. And it did. It did. The satellite, in December of that year, it ended up that there was a problem. And I'm going to read a bit of that report here. The trajectory of the spacecraft took it along the magnetic equator of Jupiter, where the ion radiation was concentrated. Peak flux for this electron radiation is 10,000 times stronger than the maximum radiation around Earth. So that would give any mechanical device and any material some trouble. Starting on December 3rd, the radiation around Jupiter caused false commands to be generated. Most of these were corrected by contingency commands, but an image of Io and a few close-ups of Jupiter were lost. That's interesting. Similar false commands would be generated on the way out from the planet. Nonetheless, Pioneer 10 did succeed in obtaining images of the moons Ganymede and Europa. So this is a really striking experiment. And this doesn't really involve any sort of statistics. This is just, it's not a graph, but it got me thinking. And I'm like, this is really extraordinary. And it got a lot of other people thinking too. And I think it really increased the funding level for the main remote, Ingo Swan's remote viewing program. And remote viewing it's not really new. Like a lot of things, it's just sort of rehashing the old. So it used to go by another name called Clairvoyance. And all that really means, if you look it up, is to sense things without aid of the senses. So a direct data transfer from reality to the mind itself. So the early pioneers of this, they probably trace back earlier than this, but the real good record that we have dates back to the 1700s. A guy named Franz Mesmer, and that's where the term mesmerize comes from. And he popularized the idea of hypnosis as well. And he and this guy, Marquis de Puiseux, who was one of his followers, they demonstrated something called somnambulistic clairvoyance, which was very common at the time. So it would be either they would take somebody who was essentially sleepwalking or in a trance and ask them things that they couldn't possibly know. And they gained some credibility and definitely some interest among a lot of different people at the time. But they had this really, really crazy experiment in 1784. So that they were treating, and I'm not sure what they were really treating him for, but there was, and I'm reading directly from Wikipedia here, a local dull-witted peasant named Victor Race. So during treatment, Race would reportedly go into a trance and undergo a personality change, becoming fluent and articulate, and giving diagnosis and prescription for his own disease, as well as those of others. Clairvoyance was a reported ability of some mediums during the spiritualist period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and psychics of many descriptions have claimed clairvoyant ability up to the present day. And there's one famous example of somebody who was really into this, and that's Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the famous writer who created Sherlock Holmes and House MD, who was based on Sherlock Holmes. And he had regularly attended seances at the time. And he was there at one of these experiments, one of these demonstrations with Victor Race. And he claims that it was genuine. So there are main people that really, they're like any kind of scientific field or any kind of artistic movement. There are pioneers. So some of the early pioneers, one guy, Russel Targ, if you're bound to run into his name on the internet if you look into this. And he was born in 1934. And it's funny how much I encounter this name during my research for this show. But what got Russel Targ into this sort of going to past the boundaries of science was an encounter with Helena Blavatsky. He found a book from his dad's bookstore. His dad owned a Chicago bookstore, and he just one day fished out a book by Helena Blavatsky, and that changed his life. And he attended Queens College in Columbia, and he took a job in the burgeoning field of chemical lasers and electro-optics. And actually I've known a lot of people that have worked in that field myself, because I work in something that's a little bit adjacent to that. And he became a senior scientist at Sylvania and various companies, and he didn't have a Ph.D. So to achieve a senior scientist position, especially at that time, that's probably more of an accomplishment than the Ph.D. itself. And this is an especially demanding field, and it's very mathematically intensive. We think about optics and lasers, and the chemistry is so complex when it comes to chemical lasers. There's electronics involved. It really ties together all sorts of engineering and scientific disciplines. And so he worked at Sylvania for a while. And in 1972, he joined a pretty famous lab that you'll hear about on the internet quite a lot, especially in the conspiracy circles. SRI, the Stanford Research Institute. And this is where he began to focus on more paranormal phenomena. And he met a famous colleague, one of the other pioneers, Harold Puthoff, there. And they started to do research in addition to remote viewing into some other sort of categories that involve. They tried to really set a scientific framework to describe the phenomenon that they were dealing with, like any good scientists. So they wanted some definition. Psychoenergetics, and that's the ability to communicate with or perturb characteristics of a designated remote target or a person. There's psychokinesis, which everybody's probably more familiar with, and that's physical actions that are performed by strictly mental means. So there's a famous, that famous spoon bending. People often cite that as an example, but it's not a good example at all because it's definitely a trick. So the trick, and I'll spoil it for everyone. It involves a chemical element of metal called gallium. So gallium bending spoons, look it up. That's how people do it. And then they, so ESP and telepathy, perceptions gathered without the assistance of known sensory means. And then finally, remote viewing is a separate category that they set aside from all of these. And remote viewing, the acquisition of information by mental means, blocked by distance, time, and intentional blocking. There's a famous experiment that Ingo performed, and it was actually that same year. And this is another one that's people have probably come across. So this, and people have tried to do similar things, and they've gotten, I think, some demonstrable results by basically putting something. People have done this out-of-body experiment, where you have somebody lie down, you can put a blindfold on them, or you can actually people put them under anesthesia in the same way, and have them observe something that's out of sight on the ceiling of the room. And that's exactly what they did with Ingo Swan. So this is the 14-foot ceiling experiment. So he, during the course of this experiment, he was blindfolded, and there was a tray of objects that were kind of held right near the ceiling. And he had no way of being able to see them. There was no light up there, and it was kind of at an angle where he couldn't be able to see any of the things that were on the tray. And he was able to identify these objects, and these experiments were blind controlled, and they were observed by skeptical psychologists. And they determined that Swann's performance on this remote viewing, the chances of him doing this were 40,000 to 1. So depending on where you are on Earth, you stand a better chance of getting struck by lightning than guessing what was in the box or on the tray on the ceiling. And he repeated this seven more times, with the same results. And the odds of this become astronomical. And he did miss a few small features when he would do this. You know, he would miss the color of something sometimes, as anyone would when you're observing something. So you think about it, it seems kind of likely that if you were going to look at something and try to take back information, there would be some decay of the quality of the information. You know, people do get kind of mixed up. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. So for him to get even half of the features of something, like just identifying random objects like a comb, a coffee pot, there's a whole host of things they used, and they were able, he and others that he trained and that others have trained have been able to do this. So it's pretty amazing. And people have been following this idea for quite a while now. There's actually a really good Reddit page that's dedicated to this. And I've been learning even more and more going on the Reddit page. So I feel like I haven't really been able to do this topic total justice in terms of a documentary kind of style. But I hope that I at least can get people as interested in this, or half as interested in this as I am.
Remote viewing. For the past 10 years, we've been investigating a phenomenon called remote viewing. In this experimental series, which has been carried on now with hundreds of subjects in the laboratory.
You were actually America's top expert in terms of being knowledgeable about the statistical research or statistical analysis of remote viewing as it was applied to those intelligence agencies. And you were asked to write a paper for Congress to review, because that's when they were considering whether to fund or defund the program. Yeah. And now we're going to get into the statistical proof.
Okay.
What was the essence of that paper that you wrote for Congress in 1995, and what were the important conclusions that you came to?
It was actually a team of two of us, and the other guy was a well-known skeptic. So the two of us were asked to look at the scientific evidence, the statistical evidence, and what I did is I looked at the evidence not just from the government laboratories, but other laboratories around the world that were studying the same kind of thing. And what I found was amazing consistency across all of the different laboratories that were studying this. And that doesn't happen if it's just a fluke. And so what I found was overwhelming statistical evidence, the 10 to a billion or whatever, against chance for the data, just by combining the data across the laboratories. The skeptic who was working with me agreed that there was overwhelming statistical evidence. He just didn't agree on what was causing it, but he had no alternative explanation.
And this is where it gets a little bit sort of personal for me. So, I've known about this kind of thing for years, and I've been interested in transcendental meditation for years. And I practiced at it with, essentially no result other than maybe going to sleep a little bit sooner, being able to take naps from it. But after a while, learning and, doing some research and finding out about, mantras and things like that, and being able to control your breathing and following a more of a protocol about going about it, I've been able to go outside my body and visit a place that I cannot identify. And this I can, with some fair reliability, I'm not like, snapping my fingers, but, I think that I can go there with some reliability and some memory intact. The trouble is that what's there is just, it's so confusing. And it's almost as though there's a hall of mirrors that's kind of obscuring the different features. But it's a factory or some sort of move installation or something like that. And so let me just tell you about it. So I call these my black and yellow visions. And black and yellow, they're the only consistent aspects of these things that have been going on for years that make any kind of logical sense. Everything about the geometries, although everything has a very sharp look to it, everything is the machine. There's a lot of machines and tubes and tanks, and everything has a really smooth-looking, perfect finish. The geometries themselves are impossible. They're confusing. But the details are just crystal clear, and they're realer than real, which is kind of a strange thing to describe, but it's as though what I'm seeing has a higher resolution. Like I have a higher resolution TV set than what I get in normal standard reality. And I'm attached to something, but it's not my body. It's like I'm floating on some sort of like fixture, and it's not uncomfortable. It feels like I'm flying. And every time this happens, I'm just so focused on trying to take it all in. And it's really difficult. It's elusive, but I try to memorize as much as I can. But it's as though the information doesn't want to leave the place. But black and yellow are always consistent. The machines are complex, they're intricate, and what's interesting is they're advanced. It's almost as though it could be human technology in the future, but there's pneumatic element. I recognize pneumatic element, electromechanical elements, electronics, fluid handling systems. This is advanced technology. And I have actually been able to make out I've seen labels on things, on some of the machinery, and I've seen strange symbols on there. And it's taken me years, and I've only recently figured out what those symbols are. And I can't exactly read them back, and I can't interpret them. But it's something called Phoenician text from ancient Egypt. And it's pretty clear to me because there's no haziness in the air. It's almost like the air has been removed from the room when I'm looking around. And what else is interesting is that the light around seems self-generated. It's like the machines are generating it. And the feeling of familiarity is always strong. I've been here before, many times. Is this home? It's a strange sort of factory, yet I'm comfortable. I'm not afraid. It's so familiar, but it's strange at the same time.